The next question that we had is I've got all these people, I would like to have all these people working for me, or I've got all these people working for me. Are they employees? Actually, I want to have them all as contractors. So, and I think I would say there are three things to bear in mind. There are three key distinctions between an employee and an independent contractor. One of them I've touched upon already, which is basically if you're an employee, IPR will more or less automatically go across. And if you do the right thing, then you'll have had a basic employment contract, and there should be an assignment in there anyway, if it's a decent precedent that you'd use. The other issue will be one of the tax consequences. If you are an employee, then your employer is going to be on the hook and responsible for effectively deducting the individual's income tax, or the individual's income tax, by way of PAYE, pay as you earn, and also making employer national insurance contributions and deducting the employee national insurance contributions. If you don't do that, then you won't be compliant with the Inland Revenue legislation, and you'll be on the hook for penalties and fines, which is a pain in the neck. A contractor is responsible, it looks after himself. So he's responsible for doing all of that, you just pay him gross, that's it. From the IPR perspective, the intellectual property, it will not automatically assign. So you definitely want to get an express assignment from your independent contractor. And we see numerous occasions where people do stuff without getting that. And in most cases, it has to be said that it's all resolved satisfactorily at the end of the day, and people are friendly about signing over their IPR. But it's also fair to say that if you can avoid it, you would prefer to avoid the situation ever arising, because what you don't want is a situation where there's any question about where your intellectual property sits at a key moment in time, i.e. before a transaction with an investor or an acquirer. What does an employee, what's an employee look like? And the third thing I should have mentioned is employment legislation, but I mean everybody's well versed in at least that people have rights if they're employees not to be unfairly dismissed, so I won't dwell on that. What does an employee look like? Well, Danvers, but maybe not actually, in retrospect. But there are basically a series of tests that the Inland Revenue and actually the Employment Tribunal apply. And they make a great thing of them being different and all the rest of it. But actually, when you look at the tests that they do apply, they are basically the same tests. And a key one will be the amount of control that you, as an employer, will be exerting over the person who's working for you. So, best to do it by way of example. An employee, if you tell the employee that you tell the worker that they've got to be there between 9 and 5, if you say that that person is entitled to, say, 4 weeks or whatever, a set period of holidays, if there's also the notion of sick pay, if you're supplying their laptops and their stationery and all of their equipment, then that person starts to look, very much like an employee, and so you're on the hook. Very little weight is attached to what you've actually called them and what contract you signed up. So just because you've called someone an independent contractor and entered into a consultancy agreement is unlikely to carry much, if any, weight. They will look at what people actually do rather than what you say that they do. Turning it on its head, what does a consultant look like? Well, if you trade, some people will be trading through companies. So if you trade through a company and actually there are a couple of people in it and you can interchange the people, then it's not so much a personal service question. That looks a bit more like a consultancy. If the consultant is taking economic risk, so he's not getting a set amount every month, the numbers can go up and down, you're not under any obligation to provide that person with work, that sort of stuff, that looks like a consultant. And then it goes on, so the opposite of what I've said for an employee, if they are providing their own kit, etc., they're more likely to be a consultant. So those things to bear in mind, but do take some time to get it right. We often see that people sort of straddled it, and it's often a very fuzzy line, because sometimes people start as consultants and then they evolve into employees, and at some stage you have to draw a line and say, okay, you've shifted from being one thing to the other thing. Why is this important? Well, one, obviously they can sue you for unfair dismissal, but that isn't my sort of principal issue, I think. My principal issue is that if the Inland Revenue come round and do an inspection on your books, and they suddenly start to find that things just aren't quite right, and in fact you've populated your office with a whole bunch of people that are effectively full-time, but you're not paying any tax for them, their inspection will be rather similar to sort of going to the dentist and having your wisdom teeth out without any anaesthetic. Right? So just be sensible about it, and just be aware that that distinction exists. And if people are starting as consultants, that they become employees, be honest about it and shift them. I think at that point I'll hand over to you, Danvers, who will take up the next piece.
Thanks, Barry. Bear with me, I've got some notes, because there's some real law involved in all of this. Just have to remind myself what it says. Barry, so if anyone's got any questions as I go along, feel free to interrupt me. So Barry's dealt with the employee and the contractor, but there's a third category which some of you have asked about, and that's the intern, the unpaid intern. I think some of you were at Geek and Roller last week and might have heard Andy McLaughlin from Huddle talking about building a team of peers and using interns. He put up a slide with a useful cheat sheet, which I had a look at, preparing this talk. It says on it, here are some, rules to follow. Something along those lines, rules to follow. Well, being a lawyer, I looked in, I want to know what the rules really are. So I looked into it, and in fact, I know Andy would agree with this, that there are no hard and fast rules. That's the fun of it. It's definitely a grey area, having unpaid interns. And the reason why it's a grey area is we have a thing called the National Minimum Wage Act, 1998. It was a piece of legislation brought in by New Labour on the back of one of their manifesto pledges. Do you remember those days when they kept their manifesto pledges? You could almost feel nostalgic. Almost. And it does what it says on the tin. It entitles people to a minimum wage. Does anyone know what the minimum wage is? Anyone want to take a guess for over 20? Okay, for people over 22, which are probably most of you in this room, it's £5.73. And if you're under 22 and over 18, it's £4.77. And if you're under 18, well, it's even less. It's not very much at all. But the way the legislation talks about it, they don't talk about employees, they talk about workers. They introduce this new concept of a worker. And a worker is somebody who works for you under an employment contract. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And this is why I need to refer to my notes. It's also somebody who has a contract, which may be express, implied, oral, or in writing, so that's pretty broad, to personally do or perform work or services for another. Well, that's pretty broad. But there's a caveat, provided that the other is not a customer or a client of a professional business undertaking carried on by the individual. I.e., you hire me or Barry as a lawyer, we're not your worker, we're your we're your service provider, so we don't get the minimum wage. We get a bit more. That's all right.